without further ado, please let me welcome first Inda.
First of all, I just want to thank Javier Duran, Maria Reyes, and the Confluence Center for organizing this event and for inviting me to come. And I would also like to thank all of you for coming out today. Actually, my principal memory of Arizona is driving through here as a child and getting caught in this kind of torrential downpour. My father had to pull over because he couldn't see anything in front of the road. So now I have I guess a better memory to add, warm and sunny, which is nice when you're coming from the Midwest, where it's not nice and sunny, it's cold and cloudy right now. So it's a pleasure to be here. The talk today draws from a larger work in progress that's focused on the interior policing of immigration in the United States. Now, a few years ago, as Javier mentioned, I published a book titled Targeting Immigrants, Government, Technology, and Ethics. And that book generally focused on the post-1965 government of undocumented immigration, and specifically, it looked at how, largely because of the construction of the U.S.-Mexico border as out of control, border policing became the major way through which political authorities sought to resolve the problem of undocumented, or in sort of popular terms, illegal immigration. Now, while the border continues to be a central site of immigration enforcement, it is also clear that interior policing has come to occupy a major role in the government of immigration. So if we just look at the post-9/11 context, we find that local and state law enforcement agencies have become progressively more involved in policing immigration matters. The number of immigrants incarcerated in local, state, and federal prisons and jails has skyrocketed, and raids of homes, workplaces, and public spaces have become rather prevalent. So what we have seen, or what we are witnessing, is the progressive criminalization of migrants and a significant expansion in the space of policing. And in the process, the boundaries of immigration enforcement have migrated inwards, turning much of the United States into a border zone of sorts, where political authorities endeavor to regulate punitively dangerous migrant illegalities. So, the larger project that I'm working on, at least one of the projects, focuses on this shift to interior policing, and it really looks at a number of specific policing practices, from raids and workplace audits to the detention and deportation of migrants. Now, so the talk today focuses on one of the primary targets of contemporary interior policing, that being kind of this category of migrant that has come to be called the criminal alien. Now, on October 18, 2011, John Morton, who is currently the Director of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, better known as ICE, announced the agency's year-end removal numbers for fiscal year 2011. Now, overall, ICE deported 396,906 individuals. Now, at the time, this was the largest total in the agency's history. It was actually surpassed this past year, when close to 410,000 individuals were deported. Notably, Norton also highlighted the number of criminal aliens, or that people charged or convicted with crimes that rendered them deportable. Such individuals accounted for approximately 55% of all deportees, or a total of 216,000 bodies. As reported in USA Today, Morton noted that the high number of criminal aliens among the deportees reflected the Obama administration's focus on sensible immigration. In the face of limited resources, he stated, we have to prioritize, and that starts with criminal offenders. We are making sure that people who game the system face the consequences. Now, the targeting of criminal offenders for removal has become one of the central priorities of contemporary immigration enforcement. And it is also one of the important but least acknowledged legacies of the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, better known as IRCA. Now, IRCA is well known for having criminalized the hiring of undocumented workers, having provided money to the Immigration and Naturalization Service, or INS, to police the nation's border, and also for having made it a path for undocumented immigrants to become legal. But the law also contained a small provision that required the Attorney General to remove, and here I quote, an alien who is convicted of an offense which makes the alien subject to deportation as expeditiously as possible after the date of conviction. Now, I think this small provision, which actually has not really received a lot of attention, has turned out to be of monumental significance. In many ways, it has helped to dramatically shape the nature of contemporary immigration enforcement. So in this talk today, what I do is explore this link between IRCA and contemporary immigration policing, focusing specifically on the regulation of criminal aliens, or that is, non-citizens who have putatively committed crimes and are thus seen as representing a particular danger to the body politic. And what I'm going to suggest is that this targeting of criminal aliens is part of kind of a broader practice of governance that has aggressively criminalized immigrants more generally. And this is a practice that I call governing immigration through crime. So what I'll do is talk in fairly broad terms about this particular way of governing, focusing on the legacy of IRCA in terms of the policing of criminal aliens, and also the policing of immigrants more generally. And I'll start by locating the government of immigration through crime in relationship to a broader trend, or to the broader trend in the U.S. of managing marginalized populations through criminal and punitive measures. Now, in terms of the slides, they're actually fairly elementary, so don't expect too much. They'll come in a little bit, but it'll help in terms of conveying certain information. Now, since the 1970s, crime and punishment have become an increasingly central means through which political authorities in the U.S. seek to govern the conduct of individuals and populations. Now, Jonathan Simon, a law professor at Berkeley, refers to this development as governing through crime. Now, governing through crime in the U.S. has come to be embodied in a number of specific practices. This facet of contemporary rule is clearly visible, for instance, in the widespread popularity of tough-on-crime sentencing regimes of just deserts, deterrence, and retribution. These regimes include such measures as quality of life campaigns and zero tolerance policing. It also includes harsher penalties and the extensive utilization of imprisonment. It includes three strikes and compulsory minimum sentencing laws, redress in juvenile court and the incarceration of minors, and more extensive parole restrictions. Now, governing through crime is further visible in the common practice of securitizing private spaces as a way of dealing with crime risks and insecurities. Now, the most notable manifestations of this practice are undoubtedly fortified enclaves, such as gated communities. Now, these enclaves are segregated spatial enclosures designed to provide a safe, orderly, and secure environment for those who dwell within them, and specifically by keeping out those that are populations that are deemed undesirable. Now, the rationale for governing through crime seems to be twofold. First, the thinking is that irresponsible individuals must be held accountable for their misdeeds, that they must be made to shoulder the burden of their lifestyle decisions. So the calculus of punishment is supposed to serve to press upon the offending or potentially offending individual the necessity of being prudent and conducting oneself responsibly. Now, second, there's this idea that citizens must protect themselves and be protected from the mass of anti-citizens or irresponsible citizens that threaten their contentment and quality of life. Now, one thing that I want to note here is that in terms of thinking about criminality, it's not necessarily the case that the nature of crime and criminality has necessarily changed in the United States. As sociologist Loic Waconis pointed out, what has changed is not so much criminality, but the attitude that society holds toward the criminal. So for example, if we take the prison, for example, the prison has always been a highly punitive institution, but up until really the 1970s or so, it also had a strong rehabilitative mission. So the idea was not simply to punish offenders, but also to re-socialize them, and re-socialize them so that they could be reintegrated in society and be useful members of the population. Now, this rehabilitative ideal appears not to be central to the contemporary prison. The prison today is really much more focused on warehousing populations. So the way in which the criminal is treated nowadays is not so much as someone who can be reintegrated into society, but someone that's irredeemable, someone who's going to continue to make more crimes, so someone that needs to be placed in prison. So I just want to note that as an aside. I think there's been a very, very fundamental change in the way in which people look at criminality in the United States. And I think it's actually part of a broader trend that where there's been a change in the way in which kind of society generally treats marginalized population, whether it's the poor, the criminal, and so on and so forth. They I think are generally regarded as undesirable. Now, this contemporary emphasis on governing through crime, I think, has had a significant impact on the way in which undocumented immigration is problematized and governed in the United States. Now, beginning in the 1970s, more or less, a crime-fighting agenda has increasingly come to determine the priorities of the immigration system. Now, this law and order approach is clearly visible in how criminally constituted subjects have become priority targets of immigration law enforcement. Now, that immigrants have come to be criminally constituted is visible in at least a couple of ways. Now, first, there's the widespread tendency in American society to think about undocumented immigrants as lawbreakers. And they are seen as lawbreakers because they do not have a legal right to be in the United States or in the country. So from the perspective of numerous commentators, undocumented immigrants are always already in violation of the law. They are, by definition, criminals. Now, second, there has also been a tendency to associate immigrants with criminality more generally. So for example, during the early 1980s, policymakers became concerned with how a rising tide of illegal immigration was bringing with it increased crime and violence. So if you look at newspaper coverage during the early 1990s, particularly in California, you find that there's a very strong preoccupation with immigrant criminality. And you see a lot of articles talking about how immigrant crime is on the increase and so on and so forth. There's been a strong linking of immigrants to criminality. And I think it's a link that has continued to be a major preoccupation in the post-9/11 period, as we will see. But in essence, it has been common in the U.S. to cast undocumented immigrants who are typically imagined as Mexican as criminals who threaten the overall well-being and security of the social body. Now, given that undocumented immigrants have largely been constructed as criminal, illegal immigrants who harm the well-being of American citizens and threaten the security of the nation, the measures that have been employed to govern them have become increasingly exclusionary and punitive. In other words, undocumented immigrants have come to be governed through crime. The most notable form that governing immigration through crime has assumed is undoubtedly the enhancement of border policing. Now, since the early 1990s, the federal government has undertaken a major boundary control offensive, one that's designed to shape the conduct of undocumented immigrants in such a way as to deter them from crossing the border. So basically, the federal government has determined that really the best way to deal with the issue of undocumented immigration is to essentially turn the U.S. into a fortified enclave. And really, if we look in terms of the amount of resources that have been invested in policing the border, particularly since the 1990s, these have been fairly impressive. So if we just think in terms of Border Patrol officials, in the early 1990s, there were probably about 3,000 to 4,000 Border Patrol agents policing the U.S.'s borders. Now that number is over 21,000. So you have a massive increase in the number of personnel involved in policing the border. Of course, in the early 1990s, there was a very minimal fencing separating the U.S. and Mexico. Now there's close around 700 miles of steel fencing separating the U.S. from Mexico. And of course, there's also been heavy investments in all sorts of technology, from drones to infrared sensors, and so on and so forth. So really, there has been this fairly massive buildup in areas, particularly the U.S.-Mexico border, and all the idea being to keep out kind of what are considered unwanted elements. Now, along with this expansion of border policing, or the federal government has also been concerned, albeit to a lesser degree until fairly recently, with policing the nation's interior. Now, in the wake of IRCA, for example, workplaces have become important targets of immigration enforcement. And of course, the idea being, since undocumented immigrants come to the U.S. to work, then a way to prevent them from coming is through policing the nation's workplaces. And significantly, IRCA also set in motion a broad concern with the policing and deportation of criminal aliens. As noted earlier, the law contained a small provision that required the Attorney General to deport non-citizens convicted of crime or convicted of removable offenses as expeditiously as possible. The provision resulted in part from this increasing link between immigrants and criminality that I talked about occurring during the early 1980s. But legislators were also concerned that the INS was failing to keep adequate track of criminal aliens in the nation's jails. And this failure meant that non-citizen convicts were simply being released back into the general population following their sentences instead of being deported. So there was this idea that the criminal alien population was being allowed to continue to potentially prey on and endanger the welfare of innocent Americans. Or at least that's the way kind of the policy discourse played out during the kind of mid-1980s. Now, to comply with the criminal alien provisions of IRCA, the INS established two important programs focused on creating partnerships with correction facilities in order to identify non-citizens of crimes prior to the release from prison or jail. Now, one of these programs is called the Institutional Removal Program. And that program essentially focused on forging ties with a group of prisons, which were believed to be about 30 in all, that held the most number of criminal aliens. The other program was called ACAP, or the Alien Criminal Apprehension Program, and that program is basically responsible for removing or basically working in the rest of the U.S.'s jails and prisons. Now, the priority targets of both the IRP and ACAP were non-citizens who had committed a class of crimes known strictly for immigration purposes as aggravated felonies. And I say strictly for immigration purposes because an aggravated felony actually includes misdemeanors, so it's not the same as a felony in criminal court. And this classification was actually introduced into immigration law with the enactment of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988. And the act defined aggravated felonies to include murder, any drug trafficking crime, or illegal trafficking in firearms or destructive devices. Now, in terms of the inclusion of any trafficking in drugs, this was all taking place in the context of the 1980s, where in the early 80s, the Reagan administration launched the war on drugs. So there was this mass sort of panic created around drugs and the harmful effects of drugs. So I think as part of the broader war on drugs, you have the inclusion of immigrants or basically drug crimes added to offenses that were considered removable. Now, importantly, subsequent between 1990 and 1996, Congress passed a series of laws that swelled the number of crimes considered aggravated felonies and for which non-citizens could be removed. And actually, I'll talk briefly about these laws a little bit later. But the duties of IRP and ACAP were accordingly expanded to target for deportation this broader group of aggravated felons. Now, one thing that I want to note here, as with kind of crime more generally, this focus on immigrant criminality does not necessarily correspond to an objective change in the nature of immigrant criminality. In fact, if you look at the social science literature on immigrants and crime, much of the literature suggests that the foreign-born population is actually much less likely to commit crimes than the native-born population. But at least in the popular imagination, there's a strong link with immigrants and criminality. But I think the reality is that they're much less likely to commit crimes. Now, while the policing of criminal aliens became an important focus of INS activities in the late 1990s, it very much took a backseat to border policing until after 9/11. Now, in the post-9/11 context, interior policing and along with it the management of criminal aliens has become a much more central component of what is often characterized as the fight against illegal immigration. Now, this turn to immigration, to interior enforcement is actually part of a new border security doctrine that has been articulated by the Department of Homeland Security. And the thinking is that only by developing what DHS calls a continuum of border security, that is treating the territorial boundaries of the U.S. and the interior as seamless security spaces, only through doing this will it be possible to fortify the physical border and deter the flow of illicit immigration. Now, this increased preoccupation with the policing of the interior has actually been signaled in a number of publications that have been put out by the Department of Homeland Security. And one of these publications, fairly central in terms of laying out their sort of vision, is called Endgame, Office of Detention and Removal Strategic Plan of 2003 to 2012. And Endgame essentially lays out the DHS vision for a secure homeland. And the stated goal, as I have up here, is to develop the capacity and capability to remove all removable aliens, focusing on those with criminal records and or outstanding orders of deportation. And the rationale here is basically that striving for 100% removal allows ICE to provide the level of immigration enforcement necessary to thwart and deter continued growth in the illegal alien population, and thus to keep America secure. Without such interior enforcement, apprehensions made by other DHS programs, such as the Border Patrol inspections and investigation, will provide will not provide the deterrent or the enforcement tools necessary to secure America's borders. Now, another important document that focuses on this prioritization is the Secure Border Strategic Plan, and that document lays out the DH's vision for a secure border. And this text also places a strong emphasis on enhancing interior enforcement and compliance with immigration laws as a way to stop the flow of people, undocumented people into the United States. And in line with Endgame, one of the goals articulated in the plan is the need to identify, apprehend, and expeditiously remove the criminal alien and fugitive population. So really, in a number of documents that were produced in kind of the early 2000s, you find kind of a fairly important focus on interior policing and specifically on the deportation of non-citizens with criminal records. And it's actually, as we saw from earlier in the talk with John Morton, it's also been kind of a top priority that we see with the Obama administration. Now, today, the Department of Homeland Security has 4 programs that are focused wholly or in part on dealing with criminal aliens. And so these programs are the Criminal Alien Program, or CAP, Secure Communities, Delegation of Immigration Authority, or 37G, and the National Fugitive Operation Program. Now, CAP was created in 2007 when IRP and ACAP were combined into a single program. So in many ways, CAP is kind of a direct descendant of programs that were set in motion by IRCA. And the CAP basically focuses on identifying criminal aliens detained in federal, state, and local jails and prisons in the United States. The program is actually found in all state and federal prisons, and it's also found in about 300 local jails. And under this particular program, ICE agents screen inmates for immigration status either in person, by phone, or by video teleconferencing. And then, after positive identification, they work to secure a final order removal prior to the end of the individual sentence so that they can be reported and not released into the general population. Another program is Secure Communities, and this one is essentially a technologically driven version of CAP. Now, through this initiative, what local police and state police are able to do is run the fingerprints of anyone they stop, regardless of guilt or eventual prosecution. They're able to run them through DHS, immigration, and other databases. And if there's a hit, the system alerts ICE, who then interviews the individuals and then decides whether or not to pursue their deportation. A third program is 287G, or the Delegation of Immigration Authority. And what this program does is permit state and local authorities, based on a memorandum of understanding with ICE, to essentially function as immigration agents. So by entering into these particular agreements, ICE can authorize local police entities to be involved in immigration policing, and this ranges from arresting people for immigration violations, and also screening the jails for undocumented and other immigrants. The final program is called the National Fugitive Operation Program, and this particular program focuses on tracking down a class of non-citizens that are called fugitives, and this is a quote here: an alien who has failed to leave the United States based upon a final order of removal, deportation, or exclusion, or who has failed to report to ICE after receiving a notice to do so. Now, all of these programs fall under an umbrella program called ICE Access, or Agreements, Cooperation in Communities to Enhance Safety and Security. And all of these programs also involve partnerships with local and state policing authorities. And the idea behind this is that the partners serve as what the DHS calls a force multiplier, meaning that it significantly expands the reach of immigration policing authority. Now, in many ways, the introduction of these programs, which are very much related to IRCA, or set in motion by IRCA, is that this expansion and introduction of enforcement programs targeting criminal aliens has really been monumental. I think in many ways, these programs are largely responsible for the large number of deportations that we have witnessed in the post-9/11 period. So for example, in 2010, CAP issued over 223,000 charging documents. That's the initial step towards removal. And from January 2000 through October 2010, the number of non-citizens identified for removal through the 287G program was more than 185,000. And this has all resulted in a precipitous rise in the number of deportation. So I just have a couple of numbers here. So if we look at fiscal year 2012, the number of people deported was close to 410,000. Again, this was this past fiscal year, and this is the largest number in the agency's history. Now, you compare that to 2001, there were only 189,000 people deported, and then we go back to 1995 when there was only about 51,000. So the number of people deported has basically doubled in the post-9/11 period, and it has increased more than 7-fold since 1995. So this is a very sort of precipitous rise in the number of deportations. Now, it is also important to note that although ICE is supposed to prioritize the targeting of immigrants who pose a danger to national security or risk to public safety, the agency tends to cast a rather wide net. Now, a large percentage of deportees actually have no criminal records. So, for the last 4 or 5 years, a majority of those who get deported on any given year have actually had no criminal record. But even the criminal alien designation is rather misleading. In 1996, Congress passed 2 very important laws. One was the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. The other, the Legal Immigration Reform and Criminal Responsibility Act. Now, what these acts did significantly increased the number of offenses for which non-citizens could be formally removed. So, whereas prior to these laws, non-citizens had to be given a sentence of 5 years or more in order for their misdeeds to count as aggravated felonies. Now, any crime carrying a sentence of a year or more can render someone an aggravated felony. And there's there's actually a list of 50 offenses that are classified as aggravated felonies for the purposes of immigration. And it includes some of the following up here: bribery, car theft, counterfeiting, drug possession, drug addiction, forgery, perjury, petty theft, prostitution, shoplifting, simple battery, tax evasion, and undocumented entry following deportation. And there's there's more than that, but basically this list includes a number of crimes that are actually considered misdemeanors in the criminal legal system, but for the purposes of immigration, they're classified as aggravated felonies. Now, so in effect, non-citizens currently being deported as criminal aliens are not necessarily what one would call sort of violent criminals who represent a threat to the public safety, but more often than not are low-level sort of non-violent offenders. So for example, if we look at the categories of crimes that immigrants deported in the last fiscal year committed, 20% were involved in some sort of traffic offense, like DUI. 20% were involved in some sort of drug-related crime, possession, use, sale, and also 20% of immigrants who were deported were for immigration-related crimes, and the most common crime was an illegal entry. One of the things that has happened over the past 4 or 5 years is that immigrants crossing the U.S.-Mexico border, when they were apprehended, generally they were just sent back to Mexico. What's increasingly happening is that immigrants crossing are nowadays charged with illegal entry. And if they get, the first time they get caught, it's a misdemeanor. The second time they get caught, it's a felony for criminal purposes. So really about 20% of the criminal alien population that was deported in 2012 was because of immigrant-related crimes. Basically nothing else but the fact that they entered the U.S. Without documents. Now, crucially, the heavy policing of migrant illegality has had a profound and highly negative impact on immigrants and their communities, with Latinos bearing the major brunt. ICE access programs have generally helped to disrupt the everyday lives of immigrants and produced a heightened sense of insecurity. As indicated earlier, or just right now, ICE's law enforcement partners are supposed to target dangerous criminal aliens, but many immigrants who get caught are actually low-level offenders, or people who simply cross paths with local police. What is clearly happening, at least in some locations, is that police are engaging in the heavy racial profiling of Latinos, making pretextual stops and arrests of people believed to be immigrants just so that their information, for example, their fingerprints, can be checked against the DHS databases. So for example, in Irving, Texas, the number of Latinos arrested for minor offenses increased twofold following the introduction of the CAMP program. And Latinos driving in Maricopa County here in Arizona are 4 to 9 times more likely to be stopped by the police than non-Latinos. And you can think there's examples across the nation, particularly in the southeast United States, but you find similar kind of fairly heavy racialized policing of migrant communities. And one of the sort of the typical tactics that's used is to set up sobriety checkpoints or other kind of traffic checkpoints, and in or near immigrant neighborhoods. And once, if immigrants get caught in these traps, they end up being arrested, oftentimes for driving without a license, and oftentimes they end up being deported. And I think more generally, it has become common for police to pull over immigrant-obtained drivers for no obvious reason or for minor traffic violations such as cracked windshields, broken tailpipes, taillights, improperly tinted windows, and so on. Not surprisingly, this targeted policing has produced a deep distrust among Latinos of police authorities in communities where ICE access programs operate. And the distrust is such that Latinos, and particularly those without documents, but I think Latinos in general, are scared to have interactions with local police officers for fear that they will be punished or end up in deportation proceedings. In fact, it appears that some immigrants have been prompted to change their behavior patterns in order to dodge contact with police or other authorities. There's actually been a number of studies that have indicated that immigrants, for example, are failing to report crimes against them. They are visiting businesses with less frequency, curtailing interaction with schools and other institutions, altering their driving habits, venturing into public space less often, and in some cases leaving particular communities altogether. There's a sociologist at Arizona State, Cecilia Menjivar, in one of her writings, she talks about how some of the people that she interviewed, undocumented immigrant parents, one of the strategies that they use to avoid being separated from their children is that they will not travel in the same car together. Because if they were to be stopped and deported, then their children will be left without a parent. And so immigrants are adapting numerous strategies in order to really deal with kind of the heavy policing environment to which they have been subjected. Now, current immigration policing practices have also, I think, had a devastating impact on the Latino community more generally. In 2008, the Pew Hispanic Center produced a study that paints, in many ways, a rather grim picture of the psychological state of Latinos. The study reports that Latinos, and this includes legal residents, citizens, and undocumented immigrants, they generally feel anxious and discriminated against amidst public immigrant bashing and enhanced immigration enforcement. And among the survey's general findings were that within the year prior to taking the survey, 1 in 10 Latinos, both U.S. citizens and non-citizens, reported being stopped by the police or other authorities and asked about their immigration status. So this is a significant number of the population. Now, 1 in 7 also said that they have had trouble finding or keeping a job because they are Latino. Now, one of the things about the survey, it took place in the context, this is when Bush was still in office, and it took place in the context of increasing raids on America's workplaces. So I think one of the things that was happening is that employers were unwilling to hire Latinos because there was the idea that they could potentially be undocumented, and if they were basically policed, then they could get in trouble for having hired undocumented workers. Now, 1 in 10 also reported difficulties finding or keeping housing. And another important finding was that approximately 40% reported being worried a lot that they, a family member, or a close friend could be deported, while 17% worried some. So essentially 57% of kind of the respondents were worried that they or somebody you could potentially be deported. So that's a significant portion of the population. Not surprisingly, immigrants reported being much more anxious about deportation, with 72% being worried a lot or some that they or a family member or somebody they know could be deported. In effect, the immigration enforcement climate has helped to create a sense of unease among Latinos and immigrants in particular. It has helped to produce an increased feeling of insecurity. Now, one of the things that I want to point out here is that even though I think this kind of fairly intense anti-immigrant immigrant policing has had a negative, there's no doubt that it has had a negative impact on the immigrant community, but that's not to say that immigrants have not not fought back. In fact, one of the things that has developed is a fairly sort of vibrant immigrant rights movement over the past basically 8 or 9 years, and kind of the most visible signs of this were the large marches that took place in the spring of 2006, when millions of people marched in the streets of cities in the United States in protest of kind of what we're seeing as a fairly repressive immigration policing. But since then, I think immigrants and their allies have continued to work and build a movement at the local, state levels. So even though here I'm focusing on sort of the negative impact, it's also the case that immigrants and their allies have definitely worked against some of these policies that have been brought to bear against them. Now, what are the important legacies of IRCA then? And with this I'll conclude, is that it has helped set in motion the contemporary practice of targeting criminal aliens for deportation, and this practice has in turn morphed into a mechanism for policing immigrant criminality more generally. Indeed, ICE-Access programs are not simply about deporting criminal aliens, they are also about incapacitating immigrants more generally. The creation of fear and insecurity among immigrants through hindering their ability to participate meaningfully in continuing life appears to be a willful production designed to isolate this population from society and render them utterly powerless. ICE-Access programs seem bent on incapacitating immigrants in order to wear down their will to work and live in the United States. Such practices in effect serve to dehumanize immigrants, break families apart, and generally deny immigrants human dignity and peace of mind. Thank you.